right, welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome back to Baggage Claim. Tonight, you get to unpack your bags with Dr. Danita. Last week was our premiere episode, and so we're into week 2, and we are excited that you are here with us on tonight. We know that on this carousel of life, that we have many bags that we carry, and sometimes bags are heavy, sometimes they're light. Unpacking our bags is not a one and done, because as we go through life, different things get dropped into our bags. Sometimes we don't even know. And so, again, I'm excited for you to take this journey with us in this baggage claim series. And so tonight we do have a guest that will be joining, and we're excited about that. I just want to put out my disclaimer that these particular lives, these shows are not meant to be a substitute for professional counseling. And so just know that they're educational, and while we will provide tips for you to be able to move in a more healthy way, they're not meant to be a substitute. And so we're going to bring on our guest for this evening. Welcome, 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 Leah. Leah is one of our team members here at Mending Hearts, and I'm just so excited that, Leah, you have joined us. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on live tonight, week 2. The topic that we're talking about tonight is race-based trauma, race-based traumatic stress, and mental health healing. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here tonight. So I appreciate the invite.
Awesome, awesome. Leah is an associate counselor here, and she also is a national board certified counselor. And so, Leah, we talked a little bit, and so just share with me or share with our audience why this topic is important to you.
Well, this topic is important to me for, I'd say, really 2 reasons. So first, I identify as a Black woman, right? And so when we talk about race-based trauma and the stress that it causes and the impact that it has on one's mental health, my mental health in particular, that I need to be mindful to make sure that I am going back and acknowledging things that have happened in my past and acknowledging how I might have handled it, the degree to which I processed it, because it is something that I need to do for my own mental health. And I think it's really easy for a lot of people to get caught up in the busyness of life, right? And so we're going to work, we're taking care of our families, we're making sure our friends are okay. And it's very easy to disconnect from our emotions and our bodies, to be honest. And so it's important to kind of tap into what is the impact of my life's experiences? How have they changed me? So as a Black woman, it is important for me to be mindful about race-based trauma and its impact on mental health. On the other side of that, as a clinician, it's important for me to be aware of race-based trauma and how it impacts clients. So the majority of the clients that I see identify as Black. And so I need to be mindful that, one, as a helper, that I am using modalities and that my practices are actually helpful to someone rather than harmful, right? We don't want to harm, we don't want to traumatize, we don't want to re-traumatize people in their therapeutic sessions. And so it is important to be intentional as a clinician to keep a critical eye and look at our modalities with a critical eye, because a lot of the things that we were taught, myself included, centered around whiteness. And so to make sure that how we interact with our clients is taking into account their experiences as Brown and Black people. So those are the reasons why this particular topic resonates with me so deeply.
That's awesome. Thanks, Leah. And we've talked, even as a team, about the importance of really doing some self reflection ourselves. And we had thought about doing this racial healing process and going through a curriculum just so that we would be as healthy as we could possibly be for the people that we serve. And so when we think about this topic that we're presenting on tonight, it's kind of like the foundation of all of the topics that will be shared throughout this particular series, because so much of what we experience is the basis of it is the trauma and the racism and the trauma that comes out of the that's born out of the racism that we experience. And so I was talking yesterday to Leah, and I was sharing how I took some time to sit, to think, reflect. If you weren't on the live last week, that's one of the things that I suggested that people begin to do as part of a mental health healing process. And also, it's just good to do at the end of the day. Most of us just roll right into bed because we've had such a long day. But taking time to sit, to think, and reflect is really important, and it's advantageous for our mental health. And so, when I was thinking about last week's live, I was sharing with Leah and I shared with others how I didn't realize. I mean, we talk about race around the dinner table and with our friends, but I didn't realize how uncomfortable I would be with the topic. And I was sharing this with Leah, and we came to the conclusion that everything is hush hush when it comes to talking about our experiences. And it's like we don't want to offend, or we don't want to share our truth because who's going to say, oh, here you go again? Like, we all get along now, we are a salad bowl now. We accept everybody now. And so just the thoughts that were going on in my mind before I shared things last week, I was literally trying to filter. And I thought, wow, there's a lot that I am realizing now that I am embarking upon this and sharing it with the public in this way. I'm realizing myself how much I have been affected by racism. And so we'll go on into our topic on this evening, but I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's important that we be transparent and that we make a connection with you, because when I share, it may give you the aha, like, wow, that's me too. That's what I experience when I'm in the cafeteria, or in spaces with whiteness that I don't feel comfortable sharing my experience.
And Dr. Danita, I think you speak to a really good point, that the hesitation that you felt, right? There was a moment where you felt uncomfortable, and it speaks to how we're socialized, right? Because to say something might disrupt what is considered the norm. But what it does for you internally is that it causes you to not deal with, your own experiences and feelings. And so I think it really does speak to the structure of the society that encourages us to silence ourselves in order to keep the peace.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thanks for adding that. So, if we look at the definition of race based stress, or traumatic stress, according to the American Psychological Association, racial trauma is a form of race based stress that affects Blacks, it affects Indigenous people, it affects all people of color. And it's the mental and emotional injury that is caused by the encounters that we have with racial bias, with ethnic discrimination, with racism and hate crimes. And we know that that ongoing in our profession, we know that ongoing exposure to various incidences of racism can lead to symptoms that we would diagnose as PTSD. But unlike PTSD, race-based traumatic stress is not considered a mental health disorder. And so when we think about that, it's labeled a mental injury that can occur as a result of living with racist systems and experiencing racism on an ongoing basis. So Leah, what do you think about, given that it's that race-based traumatic stress is not considered a mental health disorder? What do you think, or what are your thoughts about not pathologizing? And when we say not pathologizing, we mean not making it or treating it like it's a psychological abnormality. What do you think about that?
I mean, so the ways that the two are similar, right? That the body and the person perceive a threat and it affects an individual in a negative way. It's often repeated. It creates a feeling of there's no control, right? The individual doesn't have control. And so because of that, certain behaviors and traits manifest. The reason why I think it's important not to pathologize it is because there's a bigger issue at hand, right? And so racism is embedded within our society, right? It's what America was kind of founded on and structured itself upon. And so if we look at it solely as something an individual has to work through, that it doesn't acknowledge the other parts of this. So there's an author and a social worker named Resma Manikem, and he came up with an acronym, and the acronym is HIPP, H-I-P-P. And this acronym talks to the fact that race-based trauma is historical, that's the H, intergenerational, which is the I, persistent institutional, which is the first P, and then personal, which is the last P. And so when you look at it using that acronym, you realize out of all of the categories that it is only one that is purely personal. Everything else has a broader context that has to be acknowledged. And so the reason why we don't want to pathologize race-based trauma and the stress as a result is that it will be easy to move into victim blaming, right? It's easy to shift the blame to the victim because then they have the quote unquote disorder. And so we need to stay away from that and always acknowledge the cultural, the historical, the institutional factors that influence and cause these kinds of traumas.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. And also when we think about already the stigma that is placed on getting help, if people think that this is yet another disorder that could be diagnosed, it may keep them from even wanting to address it.
Sure. And there's always and the Black community has had such negative interactions with mental health and the medical community that we don't want to say this is something that's wrong with you, when in fact it's really that there's something wrong with the system. Right. And so we need to keep that stigma as far away from it as possible.
Right. Yeah. So what are some of the examples of incidents or experiences of race-based trauma, like including some of those microaggressions that we experience that lead to race-based trauma?
I mean, there are an infinite amount of them. So, we have the overt, the obvious ones, right? So if you're exposed to witnessing somebody being abused, somebody having a negative impact interaction with the police. So you take the people who witnessed the death of George Floyd, right? Mm-hmm. That is an overt traumatic, race-based traumatic incident. So you have those kinds of things. Or if your family is receiving abuse, you experience very overt racism and discrimination, or someone tells you, oh, that's not that serious. that, you know, it couldn't have been that bad. So those are kind of the overt ones. The ones that are a little bit more subtle, often they're harder to pinpoint. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about them, because you walk away and you have this feeling of you're unsettled on the inside. So was I being followed in the store? Was there a reason why I didn't get that promotion or get that job? Or this pressure, you know, we call it the black tax, right? This pressure to overperform just to be seen at an equal level. The constant minding of how your facial expressions look. Do I look like an aggressive person? Am I an angry Black woman, right? So those are the much more subtle ways that we experience this racial trauma. And what makes those difficult, but just as dangerous and just as harmful, is that they're often continuous, right? It's ongoing. And so when we see these incidents, or we experience these incidents, that is where we start saying, okay, when it happens over and over again, those repeated incidents, or there's so much that an individual cannot control, and it's based on their race, based on the way that they look, the color of their skin, then we're starting to move into that racialized trauma.
Yeah, and what we're going to share a little bit later, how to navigate through some of that ongoing. We talk about healing and we talk about coping, but when it's ongoing, it's very difficult to process how to heal, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But I do want to say that if we don't begin to utilize some of the skills and coping skills that are available, the longer it's prolonged, the longer we are experiencing racism and the ongoing microaggressions, known and unknown. A lot of times we're in this keep it moving, or we've experienced it for so long, we don't even readily recognize any often when it is actually happening. But nonetheless, things are going on in our soul and things are going on in our emotion, and it's hidden. And so when we have that hidden, prolonged, ongoing trauma, it can turn into the diagnosable disorder. And so what we don't want is for us to get to that place of being unhealthy because we haven't been able to deal with it as it's happening.
Yep. It can actually turn into PTSD, right, and, you know, those official diagnosable things, you know, anxiety and depression and so on and so forth, if we don't do the work to heal.
Right, right. So, Leah, what's some of the symptoms that people experience when they are dealing with race-based traumatic stress?
Oh, Dr. Danita, there are a ton of them. So one of the ones that is I see a lot is avoidance, right? Mm-hmm. So when we experience these incidents, so it could be outwardly and external, like I don't like going to that place, right? I've talked to people that older women, you know, I don't want to go to Macy's. I don't go to Macy's anymore. Not that Macy's is inherently wrong, but they've had experiences in different locations or different people that makes them avoid. The avoidance also can be internal. So when we experience these incidences and they're so painful and they're so difficult and uncomfortable that we start avoiding those feelings, right? And so avoidance is one thing. If we find that we're doing that, then there's something going on that we need to be mindful of. Another one is numbing, which is one that I think minorities have probably done a lot over the past 4 years with the current administration. Because there's this constant influx of violence and harm and hurt done to Black people, the Black body, all of those things, that we just can't take it anymore. And so what we do is we kind of shut off. We numb ourselves. And in some ways it's a protective thing, right? We don't want to be overwhelmed. And that also shuts us off from healing. And so it's a fine line to walk, but numbing is one. If you're experiencing intense anxiety or you're constantly thinking about incidences, then that might be a sign that you're working through or struggling with some race-based trauma. If you're you're insensitive or irritable or agitated a lot, there might be that thing. One that if it's extreme is dissociation. So when we have extreme violence upon us, that sometimes our bodies are so overwhelmed that we have to separate from ourselves, right? So we in order to get through the incident, we have to like check out of our mind. So some people describe it as like they kind of see themselves like looking from overhead, or it's like watching a movie, and that's dissociation. So that's another example. And then there's the other ones that I think we experience more frequently, but we don't notice, right? The wear and tear on our bodies, chronic health issues. So prolonged trauma and all of that, it shows up in chronic stress. It shows up in physical pain. It shows up in digestive issues. It shows up in cardiovascular disease. It shows up in hypertension. And so when we are at this high arousal and we experience high arousal, or behavioral problems, if we're talking about children and teenagers, that those are some signs that there might be some trauma that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there are a lot of them. And I think what happens is and they overlap, right? So if we start numbing and avoiding, but all of a sudden our blood pressure is higher. Or we numb and avoid, and my stomach is always hurting, right? And so the body, while we might not want to acknowledge it consciously, that the body is still responding to this trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to go back to, you talked about dissociation. Mm-hmm. And to add context to that, to help people understand more of what dissociation looks like. I usually bring people back to the movie Precious, and when she was experiencing, when she was being raped, and she would take herself someplace so that she would be able to endure and not experience the level of pain that she would experience if she remained present. And so dissociation is a protective method for our bodies, but the problem becomes when we begin to dissociate at will. We begin to dissociate because we just don't want to deal with things that we really need to stay present for. And so that's when dissociation becomes, it works against us rather than for us. And so I just wanted to highlight that. And one of the other things that I know that people experience with race-based traumatic stress is the hypervigilance. And when we think about hypervigilance, it's that always being in a heightened place of stress and a heightened awareness of your environment, to the extent that danger is always lurking. That's what the feeling is, that I'm always looking for danger, whether danger is really there or not. Within your body, that heightened sense is there and it's real. Can you tell us, Leah, what is really going on when we think about the science behind trauma? What's going on in the brain?
Yeah. So the science of it is this. So our brains, I'm going to take you back to grad school for a couple minutes. So in our brains, we have, it's called the neocortex, right? It's the front, and it's affectionately referred to as your thinking brain, right? And then we also have what's called the amygdala, which is your emotional brain. And that is a more primal part of your brain. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is I'm going to use my hands to show you, right? So this is the way your brain is. So this front, where my four fingers are, this is your neocortex. This is your thinking brain. This is where you're rational. You can think things through. You can pause before you respond. And my thumb underneath here is the amygdala. This is that primal part. And so the amygdala's purpose is to sense danger, to sense threat. So when life is fine and our bodies know that we're safe, this is how we act, right? Our ration can override our amygdala.
Mm-hmm.
What happens with trauma, though, is that when our amygdala senses there's a danger lurking, right? We are in danger, there's a threat. The amygdala basically hijacks the brain. So instead of having the neocortex kind of in control, the amygdala is all the way in control. And this is where we get that fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. I'm sure people have heard that. And when the amygdala turns on and it hijacks your whole system, that's when your adrenaline starts to run. You get, which is also called epinephrine, and you get that cortisol, which is your stress hormone, because the purpose is to get you to a safe place. So you can fight your way out, great. If you can flee and run, fine. If you can't, and it's physically impossible, or you're so flooded that you can't move, then you freeze. And that's often when that dissociation occurs. Mm-hmm. And so the body is designed to protect itself from threat. And I liked how you said earlier that the threat could be literally in front of us, like an actual physical, visible threat. Or it could be like if you've been triggered, right? Your mind and your body are responding as if the threat is in front of you, even though it's technically not. And so if you've ever seen someone who's experienced an amygdala hijack, that there's no reasoning with them. And it's not because they don't want to. They physically and physiologically can't, right? Their body's in survival mode. And so what happens is it takes time for the neocortex to come back into control. And so it takes time to kind of reset and settle in. When you're in that hijack, a lot of times you'll feel your heart is racing. You have those sweaty palms, you have goosebumps. And then often when the neocortex comes back into control, then people feel regret or embarrassment because the way they responded in those moments might have seemed irrational or seemed inappropriate. And a lot of times they feel like that regret or embarrassment afterwards. But to be perfectly honest, when someone is in the midst of trauma or they've been triggered and are re-experiencing their trauma, that they are in fight or flight. They cannot think rationally. They cannot pull it together. Their body's saying, I need to do whatever I need to do to survive right now. So right. That's what happens with the brain when trauma happens, or if someone is re-triggered regarding their trauma.
Right. I've also heard it called lizard brain. Mm-hmm. The lower mammal, the bird and the lizard, lower mammals don't have that ability to rationalize or to think or process. They just live reactionary and in protective mode. And will do whatever in a split second, as you were sharing. But it is very protective. It just at those times when what we do does not yield good results or is breaking the law, but people can't process at the time exactly. That what they're doing is not going to yield the best results for their life.
Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times in those kinds of circumstances that I think back to, when people talk about these very lethal interactions with law enforcement, is that in those moments, everyone is in survival mode. Everyone is just trying to keep themselves safe. And so, that's one of the dangers of, when everyone's in that mode, mm-hmm. bad things always happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I read a quote that said, it's exhausting to view the entire world as a potential threat.
Yes.
And there are many, many Black and brown people that, because of the experiences that they actually have had, or the experiences that we've had through vicarious trauma. Mm-hmm. Just by the ongoing viewing and ongoing news reviews of everything that is happening. We can very easily be put in the position of seeing the entire world as a potential threat, which then kind of puts you in that fight mode ongoing. Like you never really come out of it. That's the way you live in the fight mode. You live in that with that lizard brain, very rarely being able to process outside of, when you leave your safe space, what we would consider our safe spaces.
Yeah,
And
I've heard people talk about, oh, I cut you off, sorry.
no, go ahead.
I've heard people talk about that hypervigilance, like their head is on a swivel, right? They're just constantly scanning. Or I know people when they go to restaurants, they cannot sit with their back to the door because they need to be able to see the room and see the entrances.
Mm-hmm.
But that is when we're living in a state of arousal. And so we're constantly living with cortisol. We're constantly living with that adrenaline, and that does wear on your internal organs. And so that's where we get this chronic stress and how it impacts our health.
Right. That same author that you mentioned earlier, Resma Menakem, he says that our bodies exist in the present. So our bodies are in the present. Our thinking brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, there is definitely a past, there's a present, and there's a future. But when we talk about the amygdala, when our traumatized brain kicks in, there's only a present.
Yep.
There's only a now. It's what's happening now. And so that part of our brain that processes just does not get the opportunity. And in many instances, we don't want it to get the opportunity because it'll process too slow for us to, be able to act fast enough to get out of the danger.
Right.
But when we think about, as you were talking about, how it relates to encounters with law enforcement, and that everyone, the police officer and the one that is being stopped, or the one that they are chasing after, everyone is in fight, flight mode. And so when we think about that, and as it relates to hypervigilance and being in that place and living in that heightened sense, it would stand to reason that either a black man is going to run, because if we're talking about fight, flight, it doesn't mean that he's guilty. It just means that what I've seen about police officers, my brain, my prefrontal cortex does not have the time to think as to whether this is a good cop or bad cop.
Right.
And based on what I've seen on television, my amygdala says this is a bad cop. I better run.
I have to go. Yep. Absolutely.
Or I'm going to fight, or something. I'm either going to fight, I'm going to flee, or I'm going to freeze and not know what to do. Right.
Right.
And so when we think, though, about the police officer, well, when police officers go through their academy, nobody is wiping their slates clean of all that they have learned and viewed about Black and brown people. So we have the same mindset that this is a fearful person, or this is the person that has, a weapon, or this is the person that really did commit the crime and he's guilty before proven. And so they're in the same fight, flight place, that except they have a gun.
Right. And I think you bring up that idea that they're in that place, and then they're training. We don't know what their past are. We don't know what their traumas are. We don't know. But we do know that the research says that Black bodies are viewed as more dangerous. Black bodies are viewed as more aggressive. Right. And you take things, I think back to Tamir Rice, right, where he was 12 and playing with a toy gun, which people have been doing for decades. But for him, he was viewed as a threat. And as a result, he was killed. And I know that the defund the police movement is very controversial. And, and I do want to step lightly with that. But I think one of the ideas that I personally, and this is just my personal opinion, agree with is that law enforcement are trained to protect. That is what they're meant to do. Um, and in the same way that they're trained to protect, that there are other resources like mental health counselors who are trained to work with people when they're having crises. Mm-hmm. And so while defund the police is controversial, I do think there is some validity to the idea of reallocating funds so that in these circumstances, we're not requiring police, law enforcement, to act as protector, mental health clinician, domestic violence counselor, right? That's a lot of hats to wear when you're in fight and flight, right, when you're in survival. Right. And so how do we incorporate and create more interactions and more interface with mental health clinicians and those services in these situations? So I think that there's some validity to that argument that maybe the funds would be better to if some of them were reallocated so that the people who are trained to do these jobs are the ones responding, as opposed to the people who are trained to respond and know how to respond aggressively because that's what they were trained to do.
Right. Might be nice to reallocate some of those funds to mend their hearts, right?
We'll take it.
One of the things that I am engaged in, the process that I'm engaged in, is to be a chaplain here in our local city, so that I've talked with the police officers, the lieutenant and chief, and we've talked about mending hearts and me being a mental health liaison and bringing some of that awareness. And I'm really excited about that. I think that's where it begins. What if we do what we can do, whatever lane that we're in, if we've stay in that lane and do what we can do to create change, I believe that we'll be able to begin to see, even if it's just, little by little, small change. So, Leah, I wanted to go ahead. You wanted to...
I had a question for you. Am I allowed to ask you questions?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm a big reader. And I was reading a book and I saw this quote by James Baldwin. And the quote was, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are history." It kind of speaks to the quote that you shared earlier, or what you were talking about with Menachem. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about transmitted trauma, right? So how it gets transmitted into transmission through the generations, right? So what are your thoughts? What have you seen with your own clients, and how do you address that?
Yeah, so I have, so when we talk about intergenerational transmission of trauma, what we're talking about is not, it doesn't necessarily even have to be where I verbally teach my child something that is related to what I experienced in terms of racism. But when my behaviors play out as a result of what I have experienced, children pick up on that. And so even if it's, I was reading an article about 9/11 and how anxiety-filled parents became, and how they would squeeze their children's hands tighter as, just because they were so fearful about all surrounding the 9/11 and everything that happened during that time. And the children began to feel the anxiety that their parents were experiencing, even if their parents didn't pass any words or share any words. And so our experiences and our ancestors' experiences get passed down, even if they're not necessarily teaching. I've also thought about, not just from our perspective as Black people, but even from the perspective of someone who is white. I thought about how we think they must be sitting around the table and imparting racism to their children. And then you have friends that say, I don't understand how these children of this age, with the country that we live in, and I don't ascribe to, and I don't talk to my children about it. But when they see it in the textbook from generations past, all they have to do is see a picture. So when I think of being in my history class and seeing a picture in the 6th grade of a man hanging with and being dismembered, maybe 1 foot, one hand, and little children at that scene as if it were a celebration, their parents are laughing. Their parents are celebrating this. So this is what's passed down to them. This is what they get out of that. That transmission is those people are not human. This is the message they get. This is a good thing to see a man hanging and dismembered because my parents are celebrating. And so intergenerationally, things get passed down just through behavior.
Sure.
And yeah.
I think I think you're spot on with that. And to add on to it is you spoke about anxiety being passed down. And I also would add that our coping mechanisms get passed down. And so, or lack thereof. And so you want to, you go back to when our people were enslaved. And at that time, a lot of people, you could not react. You could not process. You had to repress that because your life was literally in the hands of someone else. And so as we pass down those ways of dealing with things, and now we're removed from that context, but those ways of coping are still very much in practice, right? How often do we just push through, or we don't want to think about it? Now, 300 years ago, they couldn't think about it because of their circumstances. But at this point, we have learned, and we treat that as the norm because it has become our norm. And so when we look at how we cope, is numbing what I've seen my mom or my dad or who my elders do. Is that what I've seen them do? Is fighting, is drinking, because we have these coping mechanisms that get passed down through our generations, and we're removed from the context. So what was needed then might not be needed now, but all we learn is the actual coping mechanism, which for us now is quite unhealthy.
Yeah. That's good. We're coming close to the close of our time, but I wanted to circle back around because I thought about when we were talking about the fight, flight, and freeze and what's going on in our brain. I wanted to just talk a few minutes about the rioting and black on black crime and how we constantly are saying, like, how could they be killing their own people, and how could they loot and destroy their own neighborhoods? How are we connecting what's happening in the brain to the black on black crime or the rioting that happens in our own neighborhoods?
So there's a couple things that you brought up that I think are extremely poignant. So this idea of even black on black crime, right? That name in itself is a socialization, right? Because you don't hear people say white on white crime, or the fact that most crimes against white people are committed by white people, right? And so, but there's the coining of that phrase reinforces this idea that Black bodies are violent, right? And so we have that part of it. And I lost, what was your question though? See, I got so caught up.
Well, the question was, as we were talking about the fight, flight, freeze, and what goes on in the brain, how are we making these connections to what happens during rioting and how one can riot in their own neighborhoods? Sure.
So I think on one part of that is people are tired. And you protest peacefully. You kneel during the national anthem, right? You do the things that you're supposed to do to affect change, and it still doesn't work. And so I think there's part of us that's just tired, um, and so when that happens, and when we're drained and we feel like there are no other options, people take other measures. And so this idea of they're destroying their own neighborhoods, I think, is another way of trying to reinforce that we are inherently destructive, because the real reasons are still not being acknowledged, and that fight, that survival instinct kicks in. And when you see your neighbor or whoever standing next to you get hit, get attacked, get gas sprayed on them, that you move into that survival mode, and it goes. And so when it goes, you can't just say, oh, it's time to stop now. Your brain, our bodies are not designed to work that way. So in some ways, it's easy for it to kind of catch fire in a sense. But I think it speaks to, people are tired of living in survival mode. People are tired of not being heard. And after a while, when you don't hear me say it nicely, you're going to hear me say it another way. And I would venture to say that at that point, they've been triggered. Their amygdala is hijacked, and they are in fight and flight.
Right. I think that there are groups of people who live in, I think I stated it earlier, because of the systemic issues, the systemic racism, and because it's just so ongoing in more inner city areas, because it just keeps mounting on top of each other. They don't get an opportunity to exhale. And so without the opportunity to exhale, crisis just becomes day after day for them. And we don't get to, crisis is in the eye of the beholder. We don't get an opportunity to say that this is not something that you should feel traumatized over. Everyone's body is different. Everyone's level of resilience is different. So we can't be the one who determines or measures one's traumatic experience. But when you are living in areas where systemically it just continues to never end, then you don't get an opportunity to exhale, to breathe, to think. And so it becomes very easy to react. It doesn't really matter where you are when you react, because your brain is not saying, listen, you have to go to that grocery store next week, if there's nothing in there. No, your brain isn't thinking like that, because it's in that heightened mode, and it stays there.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So what, in terms of, you brought up this idea that for many of us, that our trauma is just ongoing, right? It just layers on top of each other. So do you have any thoughts about this idea of healing? How do you heal in the midst of ongoing trauma? What do you do when it keeps coming?
I think, we talk about that. We talk about the difference between coping and healing. And coping, it does enable you to be sustained for the moment, or sustained while you're going through. But healing is an ongoing process that brings you a little bit further along than being at the place of coping. And one of the things that I think is important for healing is to, one, build up the resistance. If you're going to be consistently bombarded, then you have to have more resistance in order to be able to handle the blows, right? And so those assaults that are experienced day in and day out, it's what you're telling your mind, what you're telling yourself, how you're reframing your thoughts. That's very important. How much you literally sit with yourself and be able to process. When you don't process your feelings and sit with your feelings, you just keep stuffing them, And I think we talked about that last week. I just keep it moving, or I just keep it pushing, or, I don't have time, or say la vie, this is life, this is who we are, this is what we live. If those are if that's the mindset that we hold on to, eventually we're going to explode.
Sure.
And so, because that tears down, really, it erodes, it tears down our resilience. And so, simple things can build resilience. Having a routine of getting enough rest, eating right. We talk about this all the time, and people have a hard time processing, why we talk about rest and eating right and getting exercise. All of that has a significant bearing on our emotional health. And so we say it, but so many people have yet to really be able to make the connection that their nasty gut is affecting how they're, how they're able to sustain themselves emotionally. And so, we're going to talk about food apartheid, which is a whole nother issue that is being experienced in inner cities and in areas where they don't even get an opportunity to really eat right. And the education is not there. So again, they're constantly coming against everything that they need in order to experience having more resilience.
Yeah. There's a lot of barriers. And that's what we go back to, that it's institutionalized, right? It's in the institutions. It's historical. So that context is much larger than, oh, you just need to sleep, even though that is part of it, that there is more to it that we have to consider. Mm-hmm. I was thinking that I liked how you talked about the difference between coping and healing, mm-hmm. because I agree with that completely, that coping kind of gives us more bandwidth, right? We have a little bit more space to kind of manage. And one way that I would also add to coping and healing is finding community, mm-hmm. because we are not meant to hold this stuff by ourselves, right? We need to be able to rely on it, so that when my nervous system is completely overwhelmed, that there are people who I can go to who can calm me, right? And so finding community, and it can be difficult given that fact that we're in a pandemic right now, but even finding them online. Instagram has a ton of them, Facebook, and then your people that in finding community and sharing and having these shared experiences, mm-hmm. and having a place where you don't have to explain everything because people get it, that helps you touch some of the things that might be uncomfortable to touch. And that's what I think really is where the healing comes in, is being willing to go there, being willing to touch the pain, the willingness to be vulnerable, and go through it rather than go around it. And so I think that's kind of what will help the healing in the midst of ongoing trauma.
Yeah. And in the finding community process, I think that has to be defined also in how you are sharing your common experiences, because you can further injure getting among a group to just regurgitate or to feed it or to anger, to help each other be angry and continue to heighten that sense of anger. And it's not to say that you don't sit with your feelings, but we know that anger is a secondary emotion. So if we're going to sit with our feelings, we need to sit with the primary feelings. What are we feeling before we felt anger? And that takes time. We're feeling devalued. We're feeling hurt and pain, that we could actually walk around in a country and not be viewed as humans, and so those kinds of conversations need to be careful. We need to be careful about how we engage with our community. And sometimes when we connect with people, we're connecting with people that are unhealthy, that could kind of feed into slowing down a healing process.
Right. So, there's a difference between venting and healing. Right. And healing requires us to go back to a vulnerable place. And I think what's difficult about that is trauma causes us to put that protective shell up, right? And so to start that healing process is to say, okay, I'm willing to try to go there so that I can give this experience some light and some air and some fresh air, so that it doesn't essentially poison me, poison my body, poison my mind. But it does. It's very courageous. So when people say that they're willing and they're ready to start, but recognizing how much bravery, how much courage it takes to say, I'm ready to touch this and work through it, because it can be scary. But so with the right people, you get the support and you get the push to really process it rather than just vent.
Right. So I want to thank you, Leah. We're going to come to a close and kind of wrap up. And I want to share with the audience, as I did last week, I just want you to take a moment, and we're going to end all of our lives, all of the topics, with a moment to sit, think, and reflect. And Leah shared a lot of information. We communicated a lot of information to you. And so we want you to just take a moment to just sit and think. Thinking can only take you but so far. So what I want, when a thought comes to your mind, I want you to then begin to reflect. When you reflect, you are allowing your heart and your soul to speak. You're going to a deeper place than just kind of rehearsing the facts of what you were thinking. What is it that's going on in your soul? And so you have to take it beyond the woulda, coulda, shouldas, because a lot of times when we think, we go into a mode of, oh, I should have did this, I should have did that. What if I could have? What I could have? What I should have? And so what we want you to do is just begin to, what resonated with me in this episode, and why is it resonating? How am I? What words can I put to the feelings that I am having right now about this thought that I took away from this episode? And start to journal. It really is a healing mechanism, and we always suggest that during our counseling sessions. And so we just want you to have a little bit of a takeaway from each of the sessions. Thank you again. Thank you, Leah. This was a wonderful evening. And so we'll see you again next week with Baggage Claim, Unpack Your Bags with Dr. Danita. Have a wonderful week.